Hello, it's good to be back again. Let's see. Last night I was doing the biophysics side, and this morning I'll be doing the ancient Near Eastern side, the archaeology side. So Craig likes me because I get to do two things. You know, I'm twice the bang for the buck or something like that, I guess is the idea for it. So again, this morning here we're going to talk about archaeology. And I should, again, start with a bit of a definition so we have some sense to talk about it. So what exactly do you mean by archaeology? And it's basically the study of past human life as revealed through artifacts that people leave behind. And the picture here, there on the left, is Tel Megiddo, one of the larger tells in northern Israel that the University of Chicago excavated. They tried to do it one layer at a time, completely over the thing. And for about, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, they worked on it. And they found some really interesting finds, like the little statue there is about yay high. That's Baal, or Baal, so we got a little picture of who Baal is. So, again, very illuminating to recover artifacts like that. But again, you know, what is archaeology really? Well, that's a pretty good picture of it. You're digging up trash, you're grave robbing, and you're looking at burned out cities. They're about 3,000 years old or so, but again, that's basically what you do. And the thing that makes it really tricky is it's impossible to figure out what it is you're going to find, right? Because it's just like dumpster diving, you know, what are you going to find in it? And so you make some educated guesses about where's the best place to dig, on a tell, or on the ruins. And sometimes you find stuff, sometimes you work for years and you find nothing. So that's the dilemma with it. So to give you a feel for that, when I teach archaeology, this is one of the questions that I assign students. It's like, okay, just to give you a feel for what you can reasonably expect to find, is to wander through your house and look at the various things that you have and that you own. And then think about, okay, what is it that could survive a major fire and looting? And then for extra credit, I say, hey, you can actually, try it and see, burn your house down there, and then have the local gang come through and, loot it before you burn it, and then after you burn it. That's the best way to do it. And then, for real extra credit, you can add in an earthquake or two, why not? And then here's why it's kind of a problem as a real assignment, because you have to then just let it sit there and rot for 3,000 years. And I'm not going to be around to grade it, and you're not going to care after 3,000 years either. But that's the problem that you have in archaeology, is that not only has this stuff been burned and destroyed and looted, but it's had plenty of time to rust and rot and decay away. And here's where things in the Middle East are very nice, because in many places the environment is very dry, and they wrote on implements, on materials that can survive hundreds and thousands of years of time. They wrote on stone, or they wrote on clay, and then the clay was fired like in a kiln in the destruction, and it has become quite well preserved as a ceramic. So again, sometimes the destruction actually helps preserve the material, and with clay tablets that works well. The other thing, as I mentioned, is that many places in the Middle East are extremely dry. Some cases, even papyrus can last for millennia in terms of its preservation. So it's pretty incredible what we are able to recover, especially from the Middle East. Ed Yamauchi has a really excellent book. It's called The Stones in the Scriptures, where he works through some of those issues with archaeology. He has a very nice way of saying it. What are our odds on finding anything from the past? And he refers to it basically as a fraction of a fraction of a fraction is what we're actually able to recover. So there's the fraction of stuff that survives that original looting and destruction and fire and so on. Then there's only a fraction of that survives the 3,000, 2,000 years of rotting underground. And then there's only a fraction that we discover. There's still a lot of material that's still buried that we haven't found. And I could even add a fourth. There's only a fraction that's been published. because there have been excavations that have been done, there's things that have been found, and the excavator dies, or they just have never gotten around to actually publishing what they've found. So there's that fraction that shows up as well. So again, if you ask, what can you reasonably expect to find? I'm going to be more explicit than that. Nothing. Yes, good. And this is why in archaeology there's sort of a mantra that's referred to. It's this. Look, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If we haven't found anything that relates to some particular biblical event or historical event in general, that is no proof whatsoever that that event did not occur. Just because you're dealing with a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of stuff that has survived that we're aware of today. Another picture you can give it is this, that imagine ancient history as a 10,000 piece puzzle, and what we've been able to recover is 3 or 4 pieces. I mean, can you even figure out what the puzzle's about from 3 or 4 pieces out of a 10,000 piece puzzle? So we have that dilemma, is there's just such a tiny fraction of the past that has been preserved and recovered and rediscovered and so on. So again, the picture you might have from movies that the Ark is in some warehouse outside of Washington, D.C. is again just a little bit idealistic. And what you're more likely to find on a real site is, potsherds. Wow. That is very common, fairly typical. Again, dumpster diving, old trash is what you're able to recover. And if you find anything more than that, what's really funny is it usually shows up the last day of your dig. Okay, so you've been working all summer on this thing, and it's the last day, your plane's leaving tomorrow to fly back to the US. And one of the student workers is like, yippee, we're done. And he throws his pickaxe through the air, and it hits the ground over there, and the ground breaks open, and there's a tomb. Oh, good grief. And it's totally intact. It's not been robbed or anything, and you're sitting there going, oh man, what should we do? Should we cover it over and hope that nobody can solve this and we'll get the funding in time to come back next year? Or do we just do an emergency excavation and get the stuff out of there? And that's usually what you end up doing. Hopefully you catch your plane on the way back. But it is very fortuitous what you're able to discover. So again, if you say, man, if it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction and all that, why would people do it? I mean, why would a professor leave their nice, comfortable office environment and teaching academic students and head out into the wild, where it's actually pretty dangerous in a lot of these second, third world environments and so on that you're in? I mean, why would a professor think about doing something like that? It's just crazy. So, even if you've got power tools, to help you, it's like, why would you bother to do it? Well, it's this. There's a chance you might discover something that's totally incredible. And just to give an example of it, this is something that was found in 1954. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Pyramid of Cheops, Pharaoh Cheops. There's 2 crypts that were hermetically sealed beside the pyramid. They excavated one of them, as I said, in 1954, and found this boat kit. It was disassembled for Pharaoh's servants in the afterlife to put together. And so there it's on display now. And the wood now is starting to decay because it's being exposed to air. It was hermetically sealed before and survived over 4,000 years. I mean, that's just incredible. So you find these things that just blow you away in terms of the skill and the workmanship, and that something like this would actually be preserved. Another famous example is the Royal Cemetery of Ur, where Woolley found this was the ornamental helmet of the king, Meshkalamdung, and then his wife, Puabi, she was buried with him, as were servants who were apparently killed to be buried with them to serve them in the afterlife. But you just look at the skill of the goldsmiths and so on in building it, and it's just absolutely beautiful stuff. And this is actually what drove a lot of early archaeology was, looking for the gold, looking for the treasure, that sort of a thing. But what we've come to realize today is that the most important thing you can recover in archaeological situations are texts, okay? Because if you can get a handle on what people were thinking from their ancient writing, then you just, again, you're getting inside their head, you get a much, much better feel for the culture and so on. So that's sort of the goal today is, whatever the treasure hunters are doing before, it's if you can get texts, then you're really getting into understanding ancient peoples. So that's, again, some of the driving forces in archaeology. Now, I have to give you some background for this as well to kind of help you understand where archaeology is today. The biggest issue that we face is this. So you found something. Yay, that's exciting. But how you interpret it is absolutely critical. And unfortunately, there's two schools of thought in the archaeology world and in the theology world as well. And Herschel Shanks referred to them as the minimalists and the maximalists. Herschel Shanks was the founding editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, a journal it's a magazine that I mentioned in the sort of the resources section. And he wrote an article, this is back in the 80s, early 90s, where he's really ticked off at the minimalists. And I'll show you, what's the difference between the two here. And again, what's a minimalist in terms of archaeology? Well, these tend to be, they call themselves critical scholars or theologically liberal scholars. Maximalists, minimalists. And their basic assumption is miracles never occurred. The history in the Bible basically isn't true, and so on. In comparison to the maximalists, none of these people really like these terms, by the way, but nevertheless, it's kind of the popular assessment that's used. So conservative scholars tend to would say, well, miracles are possible, and again, did these things actually happen? Well, let's investigate it and try to see. Where again, the minimalists would just rule it out a priori; those can't occur. The minimalist approach in archaeology is to basically look for discrepancies between archaeological finds and the Bible. Okay, so that's their driving force, it seems to be. Where the maximalists are like, no, we find artifacts and let's see how they fit with the biblical text. And here's the thing that's I find most interesting, is that they will only accept the biblical account if it can be confirmed by some extra-biblical objective text or archaeological evidence that confirms it. So, again, I was taking classes on this, and the basic statement would be, we assume the Bible is wrong unless you can demonstrate its truth from some extra-biblical source. Well, given that only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction can actually be recovered, that's a pretty safe position to take, right? You can say 99.99% of the Bible, we can throw out. So when I encountered this as a student with an interest in apologetics, I'm like, and I was a Old Testament studies student at the time, so because I'm going to see how science and the Bible can fit together, so I'm studying Old Testament, and I see this attitude in my classes that, hey, the Bible, we just assume it's wrong unless it can happen to confirm it with something else. I shifted over to ancient Near Eastern studies because in that discipline, you're looking for the artifacts and the inscriptions that can confirm the Bible. Let's find evidence rather than just immediately doubt everything. So again, that attitude, this minimalist attitude, we assume it's wrong unless we find some artifact or inscription that might confirm it. Meanwhile, on the maximalist side, again, they'll give the biblical account the benefit of the doubt. They'll look for ways to get the archaeological finds to confirm and agree with the biblical record. Or if there's apparent discrepancies, we'll try to work to resolve them rather than emphasize them or try to make them worse. Now, like I mentioned, Herschel Shanks, who's not a Christian, he's a Jewish, culturally Jewish at least in his background, he's quite upset with the minimalists, but for an interesting reason. And the reason he published the article on this and worried about it was that, okay, so their attitude is the Bible's wrong unless you can prove it with some aspect of it from some archaeological evidence. But what if that find is too good? Oh, well, then the minimalists will say, oh, I guess it's a forgery, right? Because this artifact can't prove that in the Bible, right? I mean, so they'll claim some archaeological find as a forgery, or if it's a text, they'll find some alternate way to translate it so that it does not affirm the biblical text in some way. Or thirdly, what they'll do is they'll date the site or the destruction or whatever to some other time period. And an example of this third case is what Kathleen Kenyon did with Jericho. The Garstang, who excavated the site earlier in the 30s and 40s, saw clear evidence that Joshua had come in and destroyed it, and he dated that to around 1400 BC. Well, Kathleen Kenyon came later and had a number of significant biases against the nation Israel that was just forming at that time and other things. So what she did, and she conveniently ignored some of the evidence to conclude, yeah, Jericho was destroyed, but it was destroyed 150 years earlier. It was destroyed around 1550 BC rather than 1400 BC like Garstang had said. Well, 1550 is way before the time of Joshua. She said, maybe the Hyksos or somebody like that destroyed it. So again, this is what ticked Shanks off. Well, it says, okay, we're going to claim that we're looking for that external evidence, and if we find something that confirms the Bible, it's great, but wait, no, if the fit's too good, we'll find some way to avoid the fit. So again, that was frustrating to him, frustrating to me, and many others as well. By the way, I should mention, and if you, again, do more looking and research on archaeological things, the ratio between minimalists to maximalists is, any guesses? Minimalists to maximalists in the field, practicing archaeologists. Kind of close. It's 70 to 1. Okay, so that means the average thing you'll pick up is probably written by a minimalist, and therefore will take that disparaging attitude about the text. So that's one reason I just wanted to alert you to that. And that's one reason I give you the resources there that point towards the more conservative scholars for you to follow up on this more. So again, given that kind of situation, this is looking pretty hopeless. Okay, so what can archaeology confirm here relating to the Bible and so on? Well, it's very good at confirming kind of the general historical setting in which we see Abraham and the patriarchs living and other things in the early history of Israel. It kind of fills in the cracks around the biblical record is a good way to think about it. And every once in a while we recover the names and actions of a specific individual that is mentioned in the text. And one fun example of this relates to what I refer to as clay bulla. Well, what's a clay bulla? Well, it's pictured there. I'll give you a little arrow for it. It's sort of like a wax seal that we would do on a document as proof of ownership and genuine nature. Is you would take a papyrus or a parchment, you'd fold it up and tie it with string, as you see there, put a lump of clay on it, and then stamp your signet ring or your signet necklace into it as a seal. Then when the clay dries, notice you can't open that document without breaking the clay. So this is a very rare one where the parchment, where the papyrus itself is actually preserved. Normally what happens is these things got burned in the fire, but the clay gets fired and turns into ceramics, so it becomes quite well preserved, and you lose the string and the parchment itself. And this is one of the bulla that was recovered in Jerusalem, in the city of David, excavations, I think. And you can all read Paleo-Hebrew, right? I mean, it's a little small on the screen, but that was a prereq for, okay, well, anyhow, I'll give you the translation. It's kind of stunning. This belongs to Baruch, the son of Neriah, the scribe. Okay, so who's that? Okay, well, hopefully you know. This is the guy who wrote the book of Jeremiah. You know, Jeremiah dictated to Baruch, and Baruch wrote it, and he had to write it more than once because one of the kings destroyed it. But the epigrapher, the guy who studies ancient writing, is holding this bulla in his hand. They're quite small. So it's hard to keep from shaking in holding this piece of clay that Baruch had handled. It's just that kind of stunning to recover artifacts like this. And other ones that we found are fun too. This is a bulla from King Hezekiah that was recovered in excavations on the Ophel. And 10 feet away from the Hezekiah bulla was found this one. And it's partially broken, so you can't be 100% sure what it says. And once again, you can all read the Paleo. Okay. It says, Isaiah, the prophet, who is a contemporary with Hezekiah, found at the same level, 10 feet apart. And it's like, dude, you know, here's a piece of clay. And again, Isaiah's signature, if you will, this would be, you know, or his Visa card or whatever, is what these things were. That was his proof of ownership, probably on some grain that was being stored by the royal bakery. So the excavations where that was found was just here south of the south wall of the current Temple Mount. And again, the two bulla were within 10 feet of each other in a grain storage area next to the royal bakery. They're from, again, the time of Hezekiah. So you get this, good grief, you know, Baruch, Hezekiah, Isaiah, and we find many of these from other people who are mentioned in the Bible and people who aren't mentioned in the Bible as well. So you get this, gee, I'm getting their signature, you know, that I'm able to recover. So you get this sense of specific individuals. Sometimes you get specific events that are kind of fun to look at. The things that are particularly interesting is how powerful the northern kingdom was. We normally kind of focus on Judah because, you know, that one lasted longer, and that's where, you know, the Jewish history kind of comes from. But Israel was the more powerful of the two kingdoms back in the divided kingdom days. And King Ahab is referred to having 1,000 chariots that he brought against the what would that have been? That would have been against the Assyrians. And that's not mentioned in the Bible at all. So we get a sense of how powerful some of these kings were and some of the events that they did, things that they did, that they were very famous at the time that the Bible doesn't have to record. Do we get any sense of, like, miracles? Like, you know, well, here the problem is you have to ask, okay, what evidence is going to be left behind or survive, say, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead or something like that? I mean, you know, what evidence is actually going to survive? And for crossing the Red Sea, that's one of the problems you deal with. I was on a committee that thought about doing some work to try to locate it precisely, and we ended up with, well, wait, the only thing you might hope to find are some Egyptian beads from jewelry that broke when the Israelites were, you know, they're on the shore waiting to cross. That again dates back to maybe 1450 BC or so. And what are the odds on finding something like that in the sand? Wow, okay, virtually zero, unfortunately. Again, the fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction is the problem for that. Just a new thing, you may have heard in the news here recently that there's a group that claims that they've discovered the destruction layers for Sodom and Gomorrah. And kind of an interesting mechanism of destruction. It's an airburst where a meteor going through the atmosphere explodes, doesn't hit the ground, it just in flying over, through the air makes this tremendous explosion that can destroy a region. So Tel El Hammam, north of the Dead Sea, is what this group argues is, this was probably Sodom and then Gomorrah and the other cities of the plain are there in that area. The problem with that is, unfortunately, is it dates to around 1650 BC, which is about 400 years too late for Abraham. And the location on the north side of the Dead Sea doesn't seem to work because the Bible seems to describe Sodom and Gomorrah being on the southeast side of the Dead Sea. So the time isn't right, the location isn't right. That Tel El Hammam was destroyed by a meteor airburst is certainly great, okay, but again, the interpretation of it, was that Sodom and Gomorrah? Probably not, at least as far as the date and location would be concerned. So, again, to kind of summarize some things here for background, what exactly is it that archaeology can confirm? And this is what I find in working in it, that most of the time what archaeology confirms, the things that you discover, the things that you find, are these throwaway details. They're the secondary or tertiary characters in the story. Hezekiah and Isaiah, those are really exciting, okay. But this tablet here is an interesting example where it refers to, this tablet was discovered in Babylon. It's the gift receipt for Nebuzaradan, who is the chief eunuch who was with Nebuchadnezzar at the capture and destruction of Jerusalem. So, the Bible's got his name right and his title right, and he's in the right place. And, that's, if you're faking a story, right, and you have all this cast of characters, that the secondary and tertiary characters you can identify later in history. Those are the throwaway details, right? You'd expect to get Hezekiah right and Nebuchadnezzar right, but wait, we've got these other people that are accurately described in there as well. So many times what archaeology confirms is this secondary, tertiary stuff sort of filling in the cracks that gives you some confidence about the text. And in working on this over the years, this is the general sense that I've ended up with, is that as you start seeing, okay, this fraction of a fraction is discovered and confirms, and this fraction of a fraction discovers and confirms. After a while, it's a bit subjective, but you just get this sense that what I'm reading here really happened. The sense of, okay, these are real people in a real historical place and setting doing real things that the Bible's telling us about. So that aspect of it, to me, is what it can do, kind of filling in the cracks and giving it that sense that it's real. Now, for apologetics, it's a little bit different thing. And here, the value for archaeology that I see is to counter the claim of skeptics. As I mentioned, if it's in the Bible, we presume it's wrong. Right? Anything in the Bible, I'm sorry, it's just wrong. It's guilty until proven innocent. It's full of myth and legend and so on. So the question here, given the fraction of a fraction of a fraction of things that we are able to recover, what's the trend that we see in the discoveries that we make? Oh, we found something new, and that shows the Bible's wrong. Oh, we found something else new, and that shows the Bible. Or is the trend, oh, we found this, and that confirms. Oh, we found that, and that confirms. We found, what's the trend in that fraction of a fraction of a fraction of things that we are able to recover? So let me show you some of those things in that trend line. This is a fairly recent thing that's been published. The original find here, this temple of Amenhotep III in Soul of Nubia was discovered back in the 1850s and then just kind of forgotten. And by the way, if you're talking about dangerous places to go, this is in the Sudan today, and it's kind of tricky to get there and then to get out. But Titus Kennedy was able to get down there. And the Soleb was the most southern extent of the Egyptian empire, if you will, down into Cush is the term that is used for it in the Bible. And what it is it's a temple complex and a cemetery there. And again, it's all ruins today. But the one thing that stands out there in Soleb is that there was a temple, again to the Egyptian gods, that Amenhotep III made and then refurbished in the 30th year of his reign. That was sort of like a special anniversary that they did. So this Soleb temple was refurbished for Amenhotep III, again in the 30th year of his reign. And it's the normal Egyptian, temple to god Ammon, I believe, is the main one. And it has various inscriptions on walls and on pillars that are around it. And these were done as part of the refurbishing process. And of course, it's basically all propaganda here in the inscriptions. And it refers to whole bunches of groups of people that Amenhotep III subdued. Now, what's weird is we know from the historical records that Amenhotep III only did one military campaign done into Cush to actually secure this area. None of the other peoples or groups that we talk about did he actually wage a military campaign against, as far as we can tell from the historical records. But one of the inscriptions there, let's see if I press the right button, the one that's here, and there's also a duplicate of it on a wall that's not pictured. You can all read hieroglyphics, right? Okay, so I can't, so I have to refer to Titus, my friend, for this. But what the inscription says is that one of the people that I subdued was, the land of the nomads of the Lord. That's the first time that the Tetragrammaton, the Hebrew name for God, shows up in Egyptian records. When do you date this? Well, Amenhotep III, his 30th year is around 1400 BC or so. So here we've got an Egyptian pharaoh aware of the people of God wandering, where are they, in the Sinai or somewhere. They're not settled in Canaan. They would have used a different word for that. So here we've got about 1400 BC, again, from the Egyptian side, evidence for an early date to the Exodus and for the people of Israel. So it's like, well, that's pretty good. Again, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction that's there. Wow, okay. Another one that's kind of fun, and city of Lachish, now we're into the kingdom of Judah and the southern kingdom. And there's Jerusalem, of course, was the capital city, but the city of Lachish was the second biggest fortified town or city in Judah. And it's right on the trade routes there near the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the ramp. It's obviously been cleaned up a little bit, but this is the road that you took up, and then you made a right turn to go in through the gates here into the city proper. And this was destroyed by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians built a siege ramp right over here that's all covered with green. And I got to excavate that some years ago. Yeah, I mean, as a student, okay, it wasn't that powerful in the chain of command, but it was still fun to be there and dig it. But what they did about 2015 was they did some excavation there in the gate area because they wanted to turn it into a tourist attraction, so they wanted to clean up the site a little bit. So back in the 30s, the north side gate, showing these three chambers, had been excavated. And they excavated the south side there in 2015 or so, and opened up 3 additional rooms for it. So that's kind of nice. You see here, again, you come up the ramp, and then you turn to go in. So again, this is great for defending yourself because you're exposing your flank as because the city wall's right here. And then you got to turn, so your battering rams have problems, getting enough energy to knock out the gates. So again, very well designed gate. But the interesting thing is what was exposed in those southern openings. The arrows here are pointing to the, what would you call it? This was where the elders of the city would sit to conduct business and legal affairs. So they're in the gates of the city. That's often referred to in the Old Testament. That's their courtroom or meeting room. And then this other room there appears to be a shrine that, and dating the time for this dates back to the time of Hezekiah. This appears to be a shrine that Hezekiah got rid of to centralize worship in Jerusalem. It makes a comment in the Bible that he closed up all of the altars and shrines around Judah to centralize worship in Jerusalem. And so this again is the courtroom or the business room for the elders. You can see the plastered seats there that they would sit on for affairs. And then the other room there that appears to be the shrine, a horned altar where the horns look like they were broken off is how that's interpreted. But the real thing that was impressive was, how do you interpret that? Good. Americans, when I was over there, they said Americans are really good at identifying toilet seats for some reason. It's like, wow, look at that. They found a toilet seat in this shrine. What's that tell you? It was desecrated, right? So so again, this sense of, okay, Hezekiah was, again, desecrating these shrines. And how do you do that? Well, you put a toilet seat there and turn it into a latrine. And there is another example of this where Jehu, up in the northern kingdom, probably in Samaria, turned a temple of Baal or Baal into a latrine after he ended Baal worship there. And this seems to be something similar that Hezekiah did. Well, of course, what do the minimalists say, right? Well, they say, no, that wasn't a toilet seat. That was a place where people poured drink offerings down the opening. Really? Looks like a toilet seat to me, It's like, come on, give me a break. And then again, another minimalist said, no, it's not. We just don't know what it is. And it's like, yeah, man, it looks like a toilet seat to me. So again, this is that interpretation issue, right? I mean, what do you do with it? Looks like a toilet seat. But so again, just evidence, okay, that the Bible makes this passing reference to something that King Hezekiah did, and here we find evidence that confirms that. Let me go back in history because skeptics and this minimalist attitude has been sadly kind of common in biblical studies and in even in ancient Near Eastern studies a bit for some centuries. Back before archaeology was even started, the skepticism was dominant. And here's an interesting thing. There were skeptics who thought, despite the fact that you've met Alan Schliemann, who's an Assyrian, right, who doubted that the Assyrians ever existed. Okay? Why is that? Well, because it's very few Greek records, Greek historians, ever mention the Assyrian Empire. It was gone before the Greeks were really in the area, but again, they talk about Babylon and other things, and they just never mention Assyria. So skeptics concluded, well, if the Greeks don't talk about it, then the Assyrian Empire probably never existed, and all this stuff that you read about in the Bible is probably all made up, right? It's guilty unless proven innocent. You don't have any Greek records that would affirm the Assyrian Empire, so therefore, we can throw that out. Well, again, archaeology is getting started in the Middle East in the 1840s or so, and Laird, who's one of the first guys in the area doing some decent work digging around, finds this black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. And it's at the British Museum. You can go there, you can see it. Don't try to touch it, though, okay? I mean, you might get thrown out if you do that. But what this thing refers to is successful Western campaigns by the Assyrians, the people who they thought didn't exist, and this dates back to about 841 BC. And it's got, as you can see here, it's basically a series of pictures of the tribute that these various groups of people are bringing to Shalmaneser III so that he won't kill them, okay? It's like they pull up in front of a city and they say, we'll take your money either by killing you or you can just give it to us, okay, and then we'll let you live. So that was kind of the policy. And so it's kind of interesting to read these things. And here's one picture. And, oh, rats, it's cut off a little bit. Built to cuneiform? Right, you guys? Okay, well, sorry. I'll give you the English for this. What the text is saying there, this is the tribute of Jehu, the son of Omri. So there's Jehu kissing the feet of Shalmaneser III. And so not only did the Assyrians exist, right? But Jehu exists, and Omri, an earlier king of Israel, exists as well, I guess, since the Assyrians are referring to him. And we've even got a picture of him here. Oh, sorry, that showed up too fast. It's supposed to be a joke. Let me get rid of it. Okay. Do you see the thing that he's holding there? Okay. Again, I gave you the ledger for it, but it's also the first attested, right, Hebrew national kosher hot dog. It's what it looks like. I'm sorry, So I haven't tried to publish that. No one would really buy it, but it's still kind of cool. But again, we've got historical pictures and attestation that these guys really existed, and again, Jehu just decided to pay tribute rather than try to fight and lose against Shalmaneser III. So the skeptics were wrong in doubting that the Assyrian Empire existed. Other attacks that we see out there, and this is a particularly interesting one because this actually gets into as close as a century ago, that there were scholars who doubted that Judah went into exile, that Judah was destroyed by Babylon and so on. C.C. Torrey of Yale, not R.A. Torrey of Biola, was the one who was behind this. And basically what the scholars did was say, look, this entire history of the 6th and 5th centuries BC was basically rewritten by critics who rejected as unhistorical the writings of Chronicles, Ezra, Ezekiel, and even Jeremiah. Okay, it's just, we can't believe it. Well, why can't you believe it? Well, here was the big problem. Ezekiel must be a forgery, a later forgery or something like that, or just totally made up, because Ezekiel dates events in the book based on King Jehoiachin's captivity. And, King Zedekiah was the king at the time of this time interval, and Ezekiel's referring to this Jehoiachin guy who was, again, off in captivity there, had been taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar earlier. So Ezekiel doesn't have his dates right because he's dating them by this wrong king. So therefore we'll just doubt the entire text of, good grief, Ezekiel, Chronicles, Ezra, this whole idea that Judah went into exile thanks to the Babylonians. Well, again, archaeology has been kind of fun on this. Caldaway, German archaeologist, excavated Babylon for maybe about 20 years. And they're digging in Nebuchadnezzar's palace and find in a storeroom in his palace, which is near the Ishtar Gate, they find this tablet that's pictured here that is giving the provisions to a whole group of people that are in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. And one of the guys who's mentioned is Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and his household. So I guess if Nebuchadnezzar is referring to Jehoiachin as king of Judah, Ezekiel can refer to Jehoiachin as king of Judah. I mean, duh, So again, this was a major blow to that, just throw out this whole idea of an exile for Judah. Because, one of the key evidences actually turns out not to be wrong. It turns out to be true, that's Jehoiachin. Even though Zedekiah was, the ruler there in Jerusalem, Jehoiachin was still called king of Judah and so on there in Babylon. So, again, another skeptic, just so let's throw it all out. And we find one of those fraction of a fraction of a fraction of fractions that confirms a key detail in his argument was wrong. Oh, okay, I guess we should get rid of it. So, the argument again. Well, again, you get a lot of glamour shots, in the archaeology world. Man, she's got a great manicure, and she's not sweating, she's not filthy. I mean, it's just like, you get this, it's so cool to go over there and dig. Well, it's actually a little more like that. Chain gang, okay. And that's part of the problem with archaeology. Not only is it hard work, but it's destructive, because you find a layer, and to go lower, you've got to get rid of that layer. To go lower, you got to get rid of that layer. So you're destroying stuff as you go down, and that means you got to do it really carefully, because again, you can only take it apart once, and you have to record it carefully, and again, make sure you're documenting everything well. And it's particularly frustrating when you encounter, a stone wall like this, that, you date it and you figure it out, and it's all exciting, but then you've got to break the wall up to get to the layer down underneath it. So again, archaeology is fundamentally, sadly, kind of this destructive process. But occasionally destroying a wall actually has a big payoff. And this is at Tel Dan, 1993. They were getting rid of an old wall and took a break for the day. And somebody was walking by in the sunset and noticed that this stone here had writing on it. It's like, oh, that's kind of wild. So they dug it out and got all excited. And this is known as the Tel Dan inscription, based on its location. But it's Aramaic, but it's almost a dialect of Hebrew. And it appears to be from King Hazael, who has left behind a little monument after he destroyed the city. Right? So you burn it, you loot it, and so on. And then you leave behind this plaque that says, in case you're wondering, I'm the guy who destroyed it, and if I come to your town, just give me your money, right? Save me some time and you might survive. But so again, it commemorates his victory over Israel, and what's particularly cool in it is that it mentions the king of Israel there, and then in the next line, it refers to the Beit David, the house of David. And what's stunning is this is the first extra-biblical text, a text outside the Bible, that refers to David. And the minimalists went wild. Okay, it's like, that can't be referring to the house of David, the dynasty of David, right? It must be some village that we've never heard of. There's like Bethlehem, right? So there must be some little village called Beit David that we've never heard of that's being referred to in this plaque for some reason or other. Well, that alternative interpretation, right, turned out not to hold up, because a couple years later they found additional pieces of it that allowed them to get a better sense of, no, it is really referring to the king of the house of David and so on in there. And sorry, you can't translate it or interpret it away. That really is referring to, again, Judah, the southern kingdom. Israel, the northern kingdom, house of David as the southern kingdom. So, wow, we've got evidence for that. Again, that fraction of a fraction of a fraction. I mentioned grave robbing, so I should give an example of that. This is a cemetery that dates back to the first temple period, prior to that destruction from the Babylonians at 587 BC or so. And the top half of the grave or the tomb has been broken away. Okay, it was quarried away. So there's the opening. Here's where bodies were laid out. And again, this is the opening where you could come in. So two patriarchs could be laid here, and then other relatives could be laid there to rest. And this thing dates back, the artifacts in this date back to before the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar in Jerusalem. And students are always nice to demonstrate, again, when the person dies, they're laid in one of those spots, so that the skull doesn't roll when the body decomposes. Then the family would come back after a year or when they needed to use a spot after the flesh had decayed away. And then they would put the bones in this crypt down underneath here. So they're excavating the crypt area underneath, and there's some students working on this and some kids as well. And the story goes that one of the kids was down in there digging around, and he holds up this thing and goes, it's about the size of a cigarette butt, okay? And he goes, what's this? And the lead archaeologist is like, handle that very carefully and hand it to me. Okay. Gapped. It's a silver amulet. You can see the two little holes there for a string to go through, so you would wear it. Okay, and it's a rolled up, very tightly rolled up piece of silver. It's about 1 inch wide and several inches long, and they found a second one that's a little bit smaller in that crypt as well. And it took them several years to get the courage to unroll that thing, because it could just crumble in the dust, right, if you're unrolling it. But when they unrolled it, they discovered that it has writing on it. And what's the writing say? Well, it's got the priestly blessing from Numbers 6, or at least a synopsis of the priestly blessing from Numbers 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. It's an abbreviated form of that priestly blessing. And the liberals, again, the minimalists went nuts. It's like, that can't be dated to before the fall of Jerusalem, the first temple period. Why, that was just secret rites and rituals and so on. That was just all made up during the exile. That can't date back to prior to 600 BC. So they did some extremely high resolution photography on it, on the scratches on the silver. And you can date the writing to within a century, and it dates to well before the exile. So it was like, oops. Once again, the minimalist argument didn't hold up. The skeptic, again, was wrong. So let me give you a New Testament example, because just to kind of round things out. One of the biggest challenges in the New Testament has been, regarding its reliability and historicity, has been, when was the Gospel of John written? And again, in the 1800s, one of the major schools, Tübingen, would argue that there's just no way that the Gospel of John could date to prior to the 2nd or even the 3rd century. Because, no first century Jew would ever think of the Messiah, a man, as God or something like that. And no first century Jew would use that logos concept to think of, in the beginning was the Word, and link that to Jesus and so on. This is all very late Gentile influence, that's been woven into the Gospel of John. There's no way that a Jew would write or think about Jesus in this way. Well, again, one little fragment can decide the day. And this is the fragment P52 it's down in the John Rylands library. This was recovered in Egypt in 1920. 1920. And what it has on the front of it is John 18, very clearly, 31 to 33. And it's also written on the back side. It has John 18, 37 to 38. And you can date the writing, because writing styles kind of vary from generation to generation, and it dates back to around 125 AD. So you go, wait, we've got a Gospel of John in Egypt, 125 AD. That's long before the Tübingen school would have wanted the Gospel of John to be around to begin with, but it was written up in Ephesus. So it's down in Egypt around 120. So this has been one of the archaeological evidences that has shifted scholarship today, and even the skeptical scholarship, to grant that all the Gospels were written in the first century. Because Gospel of John is recognized as the last one written. It's sort of John looking over the others and saying, well, let me add a few things to fill in the details. And if that dates back to, first century, then all the other Gospels have to be earlier. So again, one good papyrus fragment can do incredible things in terms of confirming, what conservatives have felt and argued for all along. So again, to kind of wrap things up here, I get this question a lot. So it's like, man, if you could pick one thing, that you would find other than that Coke can that you saw earlier, right? What would be that one thing that you'd really hope that you could discover that would, again, confirm the truth of the Bible? And I guess as an Old Testament person, I would say, if you could give me the book of Deuteronomy from 1400 BC, that'd be like awesome, But I think we actually have something better than that, and that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these, again, are the things that, if you look at any top 10 list of archaeological finds, Dead Sea Scrolls always end up on the top. Again, it's just amazing. It was an accidental discovery, like virtually all these things are. Some shepherd boys are trying to find a stray goat, so they're throwing rocks in the caves as they're going up this valley, and they hear a pot break when they throw in this thing, and they think they're going to be gold in there, and it's just these scrolls and these pots. It's like yuck, So anyhow, in fact, one of the stories says that when they took them back to their camp, the leather was so good that they were almost made into shoes. It's like they weren't, but again, it was just kind of weird. Of the scrolls, the scroll that people will list as number one, and I would certainly agree, is the Great Scroll of Isaiah. It's the whole book. It's intact. Okay, everything else that we've got from the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragments. Here we've got the whole thing intact, and it's just incredibly well preserved. And I want to focus on just one chapter here, Isaiah 53, is an example of it. Because what the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed was, once again, what conservatives and conservative Jews had argued for some time, is that the scribes who copied the biblical text, because they were so incredibly valuable and they're copying them by hand, used all kinds of error correction techniques to minimize copying errors in the course of doing it. And here we've recovered a text, right, an incredibly old text of the book of Isaiah. Let's compare it to the next earliest Hebrew manuscript that we have. There's the Aleppo Codex and then the Codex Leningradensius, which date to about 1000 AD. And there's only 17 letters different in the chapter of Isaiah 53. 10 are differences in how you would spell the word. You still recognize it as the same word. You put in vowels, vowel letters, to sometimes make it easier to read. That was a convention they adopted later. There's 4 stylistic changes, but you still recognize the text. It doesn't affect the meaning. The word noon, light, is in verse 11. That's the only real substantial difference, and it actually makes more sense if it has light in the text. And they carbon dated this thing, and you can also date it by the style of the handwriting. It dates back to 150, 125 BC. Some people say it's even earlier, it might go back to 300 BC. But here we've got a text of the book of Isaiah that's clearly before any Christian or Jewish influence as it might relate to Jesus. So what's Isaiah 53 talk about, right? You guys probably all know this, but just to kind of go through it. This is the passage about the suffering servant that is prophesied and talked about. Again, Isaiah talks about it over the course of several chapters. But it says, look, he was despised. He was shunned by men. It was our sickness he was bearing, our suffering that he endured. He was wounded because of our sins, and by his bruises we were healed. And the Lord visited upon him the guilt of all of us. And he was cut off. That's the Hebrew idiom for killed, right? He was cut off out of the land of the living through the sin of my people who deserved the punishment. So here in Isaiah 53 is the clearest, most extensive passage in the whole Bible on, to me, one of the core documents of the Christian faith, the substitutionary atonement, right? What was the Messiah supposed to do? Well, he was going to come and die for the sins of the people. His death would be the punishment for the sin of my people. And this is a passage that talks about that most extensively of anything else in the Bible. And it continues, it says, well, look, if he made himself an offering for guilt, he might see offspring and have long life. So wait, how does he die and still have offspring and have a long life? And that through him the Lord's purpose might prosper. Okay. And then, my righteous servant makes the many righteous. It's their punishment that he bears, right? Again, that sense. Oh, then assuredly, I'll give him the many as his portion, and he shall receive the multitude as his spoil. Wait, he's dead, right? He exposed himself to death and yet was numbered among the sinners. So how does he die and live? And he's a substitutionary atonement. And here's what's wild. I'm quoting from the Jewish Publication Society of Isaiah 53. This is a passage that is not read in synagogue. And I think you can kind of see why. Because, the rabbi would read it, and somewhere in the audience, Mommy, that sounds like Jesus, Because, you think about it. Okay, who in the world is Isaiah talking about here? What person in history has come and again suffered and died, and again, what Jewish person has done anything like that? Who's this suffering servant? And it's like there's only one Jew in history that this thing plausibly fits at all. And what we have here in Isaiah 53 is a prophecy, because Isaiah spoke about this, wrote about this in about 700 AD, back there with Hezekiah. And we have a text of it from 150, 125 BC, century before Jesus himself was actually here. And to me, an important thing about this is that's really important is Jesus didn't just show up one day in Nazareth or in Jerusalem and say, "Hi, I'm the Messiah, I'm here to die for you," right? Isaiah is preparing a culture for centuries to look for this servant, this righteous servant who's going to be a guilt offering, right? So when John the Baptist is there and says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," everybody knew what he was talking about. Because this was, again, there's a servant coming who's going to be the Messiah, and this is one of the things that he's going to do. And here we have that prophecy of Isaiah about the suffering servant who's going to be a substitutionary atonement. We've got a text of it that predates by well over a century Jesus actually coming. Again, so it wasn't something that Christians put in later, or the Jews erased or put in or whatever. We have the evidence of the prophecy given long before the event actually took place. Again, as part of preparing the culture to expect the Messiah. So, again, to sort of summarize where we've been going, what's sort of the ultimate goal of biblical archaeology here? Well, again, there's all kinds of fun facts that you can learn about, again, from that fraction of a fraction of a fraction that fills in the cracks and so on and gives you a sense that, gee, these things really happened. Again, the questions to me that are important are, okay, is the Bible reliable in what it's telling me? Is there a God behind it who's trustworthy? And is this story about our redemption and salvation, is that actually real? Or is it just myths and legends or something like that? And of course, there's all kinds of questions you can ask, like, gee, was the tomb empty or something like that on Easter morning? And that's kind of beyond the bounds of archaeology to address, unfortunately. Archaeology doesn't give us evidence like what Thomas had here, stick your hand in my wounds and so on and believe. But I think archaeology gives us enough evidence to make belief reasonable, especially again as you look at the trend. You look at the skeptics who say, no, just doubt everything. It's guilty unless proven innocent. And then you find, oh, wait, you find this proof. Oh, good grief, the Assyrians actually did exist, and they really were brutal. Okay, wow, that's kind of scary. And then, oh, good grief, we find this, hey, Isaiah, we've got his seal, okay? And you find these pieces that confirm the details of the text, the basic historical details of the text. So as you get a fraction of a fraction of a fraction recovered, the trend is that the skeptics, the doubters, are shown to be wrong. And after a while of watching this, I end up saying basically this. You know, I think in the world of archaeology, we're in a situation where it really takes less faith to trust in Jesus, that he is who he says he was and who he was prophesied to be, than to be a skeptic about it. I mean, the evidence that's accumulating, again, it's only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, but the evidence that's accumulating is filling in the cracks and confirming and showing, gee, the skeptic's basis is not as well-founded as they might want it to be, and it just seems much more reasonable to believe in Jesus on this. So, why don't we close it in prayer here then? So, Father, just thank you that you haven't left us with a blind faith, just believe it despite the evidence or something like that, even though skeptics and so on seem to have powerful voices. But you have given us enough that we can trust you and we can believe you, that these people really existed, that these events really happened. Even these miraculous things happened to rescue us and to redeem us. So again, I just pray that this whole conference would be a blessing to the people here, that we might draw closer to you, and just to appreciate that there are good answers, and there are reasons that we can believe and trust you. And we just thank you so much that you did come to suffer and to substitute yourself as the punishment that we deserve. And ask that we might live that out as your ambassadors in reaching others. Just thank you again. In Jesus' name, amen.